The cabin door swung open to a silence that felt wrong. Cole Harlan stood frozen in the threshold, rifle slack in his grip, his eyes locked on the dark shape curled beneath his wool blanket. Someone was in his bed. Out here, 50 miles from the nearest town, that meant one thing: trouble had found him again. He'd sworn off trouble 3 years ago when he buried the last person who trusted him. But as the figure stirred and a pale hand emerged from the covers, trembling and streaked with dried blood, Cole knew that oath was about to break. The woman's eyes met his, wild, terrified, and absolutely refusing to beg. She didn't ask for help. She just stared at him like she was memorizing his face in case he became the last thing she ever saw. If you want to see how this story unfolds, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. Cole didn't lower the rifle. The woman in his bed watched him with the kind of stillness that came from practice. Someone who'd learned that moving too fast could get you killed. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones too sharp beneath skin that had gone translucent from cold, or hunger, or both. Dark hair stuck to her forehead in wet tangles, and when she finally shifted, he saw the tear in her coat sleeve and the makeshift bandage underneath, already soaked through. "How long you been here?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Since afternoon." Her words were barely above a whisper, but there was no apology in them. "Your door was unlocked." "It's supposed to be." Cole stepped inside and kicked the door shut behind him, shutting out the wind that had been clawing at his back all day. This far out, locked doors just slow you down when you need to get in fast. She didn't respond to that, just kept watching him like he was a wolf that might decide whether to eat her or walk away. Cole leaned the rifle against the wall, not too far, never too far, and crossed to the stove. The fire had burned down to embers. He fed it fresh wood without looking at her. "You got a name?" Silence stretched between them. Cole straightened and turned back to face her. The woman had sat up slightly, the blanket pooling around her waist. Her coat was military surplus, maybe 20 years old, patched in a dozen places. The kind of thing you wore when you couldn't afford to replace it and couldn't afford to freeze. "Lyra." She said it like she was testing whether it still fit. "Lyra Voss." "All right, Lyra Voss." Cole pulled off his gloves and tossed them onto the table. "You running from the law or from people?" "People." "They close?" "I don't know." Her jaw tightened. "I thought I lost them 2 days ago, but I keep thinking I'm hearing things. Horses, voices." Cole studied her. The wound on her arm wasn't fresh, at least 12 hours, maybe more. The blood on her hands had dried brown. She'd been running hard, and not just from the cold. "When did you last eat?" Lyra blinked at the question. "Yesterday morning, I think." He moved to the cupboard and pulled down a tin of hardtack and some dried venison. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. He set it on the small table beside the stove and gestured at it. "Eat slow. Your stomach's probably forgotten how to handle food." She stared at the offering like it might vanish if she reached for it. Then, moving carefully, she swung her legs out of the bed and stood. Her knees buckled immediately. Cole caught her by the elbow before she hit the floor. "Easy." He guided her to the chair, and she collapsed into it with a sharp breath. Up close, he could see the fever flush on her cheeks, the glassy brightness in her eyes. The wound was infected. Of course it was. Lyra grabbed a piece of hardtack with shaking fingers and bit into it. She chewed mechanically, eyes distant, like she was somewhere else entirely. Cole went back to the cupboard and found the whiskey and the clean rags he kept for emergencies. When he set them on the table, Lyra looked up at him. "Your arm," he said. "Let me see it." "It's fine." "It's not fine. You got fever and that bandage is useless." He pulled the other chair over and sat down across from her. "I can leave it, and you can die slow. Or you can let me clean it, and maybe you don't. Your choice." Lyra hesitated. Then, with obvious reluctance, she set down the hardtack and started unwrapping the bandage. The cloth stuck to the wound, and she hissed through her teeth as it pulled free. The gash was 4 inches long, ragged at the edges. Someone had cut her with something dull or serrated. "Knife?" Cole asked. "Broken bottle." She said it flatly, like it didn't matter. Cole poured whiskey onto a clean rag and pressed it against the wound. Lyra went rigid, her free hand gripping the edge of the table hard enough that her knuckles went white. She didn't make a sound. Cole worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best he could, then wrapped it with fresh cloth and tied it off. That'll hold for now, he said. But you need rest, and you need to keep eating. Infection like that can turn bad fast. Lyra looked down at her arm, then back up at him. Why are you helping me? It was a fair question. Cole stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark expanse of snow and trees. The wind was picking up again, rattling the shutters. Because I'm here and you needed help. He didn't turn around. That's all. People don't usually work that way. No, Cole agreed. They don't. He heard her shift in the chair behind him, the scrape of wood against wood. When he glanced back, she'd returned to eating, slower this time, more deliberate. The firelight caught the sharp lines of her face and made her look both younger and older than she probably was. How long do I have? Lyra asked quietly. Until what? Until you kick me out. Cole turned to face her fully. She was watching him again with that same measuring look, like she was calculating odds and distances. Storm's coming in tonight, he said. You go out in that with a fever, you'll be dead before dawn. So you stay until the weather breaks, and until that arm starts healing. After that, we'll see. Lyra's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a fraction of tension releasing. And if they come looking for me before then we deal with it. You don't know what you're saying. Her voice dropped lower. These aren't just men looking for a runaway. They own things, people. They don't stop. Everyone stops eventually. Cole moved back to the stove and poured water from the kettle into a battered tin cup. He handed it to her. Drink this. Then get back in that bed and sleep. You look half dead already. She took the cup but didn't drink right away. What do I call you? Cole. Cole Harlan. All right, Cole Harlan. Lyra raised the cup slightly, almost like a toast. Thank you. He didn't answer, just nodded and turned back to banking the fire for the night. Behind him, he heard her stand and make her way slowly back to the bed. The ropes creaked as she settled onto the thin mattress. Cole stood by the stove for a long time after that, listening to the wind howl outside and the quieter sound of Lyra's breathing evening out into sleep. He hadn't lied to her. The storm was coming, and she'd die if she went out in it. But that wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he'd stopped caring whether he lived or died about 3 years ago, right around the time he'd watched his partner bleed out in a canyon because Cole had been too slow, too cautious, too afraid to take the shot that mattered. He'd come out here to disappear, to let the wilderness grind him down into nothing. But standing in this cabin with a half-dead stranger sleeping in his bed, Cole felt something he thought was gone for good. The weight of responsibility. The sense that what he did next actually mattered. He hated it, and he couldn't walk away from it. The storm hit just after midnight. Cole woke to the sound of wind slamming against the cabin walls like fists. Snow hissed against the windows, and the temperature inside had dropped enough that he could see his breath. He got up and fed the fire, then checked on Lyra. She was still asleep, but restless. Her forehead was hot to the touch, and she'd kicked off most of the blanket. Cole pulled it back over her and went to wet another cloth with cool water. When he pressed it against her forehead, her eyes fluttered open. Cole? Fever's climbing. This should help. She closed her eyes again. How bad is the storm? Bad enough. We're not going anywhere for a while. Good. The word was barely audible. I'm tired of running. Cole didn't know what to say to that, so he just kept the cloth cool and waited for her to slip back under. It took longer this time. She fought it, her body twitching and tensing like she was trying to stay alert even while unconscious. Finally, her breathing deepened and her face relaxed. Cole sat in the chair by the bed and watched the firelight dance across the walls. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He wasn't sure which scared him more. Morning came late and gray. The storm had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow and a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. Cole woke stiff and cold in the chair. Lyra was still asleep, her breathing quieter now, less labored. The fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't gotten worse either. He stood and stretched, joints popping, then made his way to the door. The snow had drifted against it, and he had to shove hard to get it open. Cold air rushed in, sharp enough to sting his lungs. He stepped outside and surveyed the damage. The path to the woodpile was buried. The lean-to where he kept his horse had held, but just barely. Everything looked different under the fresh snow, softer, cleaner, like the world had been reset. Cole spent the next hour digging out the essentials. By the time he came back inside, Lyra was awake and sitting up in bed, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You look better," Cole said. "I feel like hell." But there was color in her cheeks now, and her eyes were clearer. "How long was I out?" "Most of the night and half the morning." He shook snow off his coat and hung it by the door. "Storm's done. Snow's deep, but it'll settle." Lyra looked toward the window. "They won't be able to track me through that." "No, but they won't be able to move fast either. Works both ways." She nodded slowly, then winced and touched her arm. "This hurts less than it did." "That's good. Means the infection's not spreading." Cole moved to the stove and started preparing a thin stew from dried meat and root vegetables. "You need to keep eating and stay warm. Don't push it." "I'm not used to being still." Lyra shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position. "Feels wrong. You've been running a long time." 3 months. Before that, I was... She trailed off, staring at her hands. "It doesn't matter. I'm out now." Cole stirred the pot and didn't press. He'd learned a long time ago that people told you what they needed to tell you when they were ready. Pushing just made them clam up or lie. They ate in silence. Lyra managed half a bowl before exhaustion caught up with her again. She set the bowl aside and leaned back against the wall. "Tell me about this place," she said. "How'd you end up out here?" "Needed somewhere quiet." "That's not an answer." Cole smiled faintly. "No, it's not." He took another bite of stew. "I used to work with people. Partner mostly. We did bounty work, tracked down fugitives, that kind of thing. 3 years back, a job went bad. He died because I hesitated. After that, I didn't see much point in being around people anymore." Lyra watched him carefully. "You blame yourself." "I was the one holding the rifle. That doesn't mean it was your fault." "Doesn't mean it wasn't either." Cole set his bowl down. "Point is, I came out here to disappear. Been working fine until last night. Sorry to ruin your solitude." "Didn't say I minded." The words came out before he could think better of them. He stood abruptly and carried his bowl to the wash basin. "You should rest more. I'm going to check the perimeter, make sure nothing got damaged in the storm." Lyra didn't argue. Cole grabbed his coat and rifle and headed back out into the cold. The truth was, he did mind, but not in the way he expected. Having someone else in the cabin threw off the careful rhythm he'd built over 3 years of isolation. But it also reminded him of something he'd forgotten, what it felt like to be needed, to have his choices matter to someone other than himself. He didn't know if that was a gift or a curse yet. The next 3 days fell into a pattern. Lyra's fever broke on the second day, and by the third she was strong enough to move around the cabin without help. She didn't talk much, but she watched everything Cole did with sharp attention. How he maintained the fire, how he rationed supplies, how he kept the rifle clean and loaded. On the 4th morning, Cole woke to find her already up, standing by the window and staring out at the snow-covered landscape. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." She didn't turn around. "I keep thinking I hear things." Cole joined her at the window. The morning light was pale and flat, turning everything gray. "You see anything?" "No, but that doesn't mean they're not out there." "Tell me about them." Cole kept his voice level, neutral. "The people you're running from." Lyra was quiet for a long moment. Then she exhaled slowly. "They call themselves the Syndicate. Not very creative, I know. But they don't need to be creative when they've got money and guns and people who owe them favors in every town between here and the Missouri River. What did they want with you?" "What they always want, labor, compliance. I worked in one of their operations for 2 years before I figured out there was no legal way out. They don't pay you enough to leave, and they don't let you quit. Your property." Her voice was flat, matter of fact. "I got tired of being property." "So you ran." "So I ran." She turned to face him. "And they sent people after me, 2 men at first. I lost them in Billings. Then 3 more caught up with me outside Helena. I got away, but that's when I got this." She touched her wounded arm. "I've been moving ever since. Thought if I went far enough into the wilderness, they'd give up." "People like that don't give up," Cole said. "Not if their reputation depends on getting you back." "I know." Lyra's jaw tightened. "That's why I'm telling you this. If they find me here, they'll come through you to get to me. I won't let that happen. If I see any sign of them, I'm gone. You won't have to... Stop. Cole's voice was quiet but firm. You're not going anywhere until that arm's healed and you've got your strength back. After that, if you want to leave, that's your choice. But right now, you stay. Lyra stared at him. Why? Because I said so. Cole moved past her to the stove. And because if you go out there half-healed and they catch you, you'll wish you'd stayed. She didn't argue, but Cole could feel her watching him as he prepared breakfast, weighing his words against her own instincts. Trust didn't come easy to someone who'd been property. He understood that. Hell, he'd been there himself in different ways. Yacob. On the 5th day, Cole found the first track. He'd gone out to check his snares, following the line he'd set up through the sparse woods north of the cabin. The snow had settled enough that walking was easier, though still slow work. He was pulling a frozen rabbit from the 3rd snare when he saw it, a boot print, fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. Cole crouched and studied it. Large, probably a man's size. The tread pattern was distinctive, military surplus, the same kind he'd seen on syndicate enforcers back when he'd still worked jobs near the bigger settlements. Whoever made this track had come through within the last 12 hours. He followed the trail for half a mile, moving carefully, keeping to cover. The tracks led along the ridge that overlooked his cabin, then doubled back and headed northeast. 2 sets of prints. 2 riders, probably, though he couldn't see where they'd left their horses. They were searching the area, methodically, looking for someone. Cole returned to the cabin and found Lyra skinning the rabbit he'd left on the porch. She looked up when he approached. You were gone a while. Found something. He set his rifle inside the door. Tracks. 2 men, probably syndicate. They're searching the ridge. Lyra's hands went still. How close? Close enough. Half mile, maybe less. Cole pulled off his gloves. They didn't come to the cabin, but they will if they keep searching. Then I need to leave. She set down the knife and stood. Now, before they... No. Cole stepped between her and the door. You leave now. You're running blind into country you don't know with men behind you who do. That's how you get caught. Then what do you suggest? Her voice was sharp with fear. Wait here until they knock on the door? We prepare. Cole moved to the corner where he kept his extra ammunition. We secure the cabin, we watch the approaches, and we make sure that if they do come, we're ready. Lyra shook her head. You don't understand. These men are professionals. They've done this before. So have I. Cole turned to face her. I tracked people for 5 years. I know how they think, and out here on ground I know and they don't, we've got the advantage. She stared at him, her fear warring with something else. Maybe hope, maybe desperation. Finally, she nodded once, sharp and decisive. All right, tell me what to do. They spent the rest of the day fortifying. Cole showed Lyra how to bar the door and shutters from inside, where he kept his spare rifle and ammunition, the sight lines from each window. He checked every approach to the cabin, looking for places where someone could get close without being seen. There weren't many. As the sun started to sink, Cole built up the fire and made a cold dinner. No smoke from cooking to give them away. They ate quickly, efficiently. Lyra had shifted into a different mode, Cole noticed. Less afraid, more focused. She'd done this before, he realized, prepared for violence, waited for it to find her. When was the last time they got close? Cole asked. Outside Helena. I was staying in a boarding house. They came at night, broke the door down. She spoke without looking at him, her eyes on the window. I went out the back window, lost them in the alleys. That's when you got cut. One of them caught up with me near the rail yard. We fought. I got away, but just barely. She touched her arm unconsciously. I've been moving fast ever since. Didn't think they'd follow this far. Men like that, they've got pride tied up in the hunt. Cole set his plate aside. Losing you once is bad luck. Losing you twice is embarrassment. They need to bring you back or kill you to prove they can. I know. Lyra's voice was flat. I've made peace with that. Doesn't mean it has to happen. She looked at him then, really looked at him. You're willing to fight for someone you barely know? I'm willing to fight for someone who's standing in my cabin. Cole stood and moved to the window, scanning the darkness outside. That's enough. Lyra didn't respond, but when Cole glanced back, he saw something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Belief. Not in him necessarily, but in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to run forever. Night fell hard and cold. Cole kept watch while Lyra slept fitfully on the bed, the rifle close to her hand. He'd given her the spare, an older Winchester, reliable if not fancy, and shown her the basics. She'd handled it like someone who'd fired a gun before but never depended on one. Around midnight, he heard it, the distant sound of horses moving through snow. Cole's hand went to his rifle. He moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. At first he saw nothing. Then, movement. Two shapes on horseback, maybe 300 yards out following the tree line. They weren't making any effort to hide. That meant they were either confident or stupid. Cole was betting on confident. He crossed to the bed and touched Lyra's shoulder. She woke instantly, her hand going to the Winchester. "They're here," Cole said quietly. "Two riders. Northeast, following the trees." Lyra was on her feet in seconds, moving to the other window. "Can they see the cabin?" "Not yet, but they're getting closer." Cole watched the riders stop and dismount. They were consulting about something, maybe a map or tracks. "They're searching, not attacking, still trying to figure out if you're here." "What do we do?" "We wait. Let them make the first move." Cole moved back to his position. "If they approach, we show them we're here and we're armed. Most hunters back off when they realize the prey has teeth." "And if they don't?" Cole didn't answer. He didn't need to. They watched in silence as the two men remounted and continued their circuit. They came within 200 yards of the cabin, close enough that Cole could see the rifles slung across their backs, the heavy coats, the way they moved with the casual confidence of men who'd done this many times before. Then, just as Cole was preparing for them to turn toward the cabin, something changed. One of the men pulled out what looked like a spyglass and scanned the area. He said something to his partner, gesturing north. After a moment of discussion, they turned their horses and headed away, following a different trail. Cole watched them disappear into the darkness. He stayed at the window for another hour, making sure they didn't circle back. Finally, when he was reasonably certain they were gone, he stepped away and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Lyra was still at her window, rigid with tension. Are they gone? For now. They picked up a different trail. Might be tracking someone else, or they might have decided you went a different direction. Or it's a trick. Lyra turned to face him. They could be waiting for us to relax, to think we're safe. Could be, Cole agreed. But we can't live at full alert forever. We take shifts, we stay ready, and we don't let our guard down. But we also don't jump at shadows. Lyra nodded slowly. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline crash hitting her all at once. I don't know if I can do this. Yes, you can. Cole took the Winchester from her and set it against the wall. You've been doing it for 3 months. A few more days won't break you. A few more days, then what? They're not going to stop looking. Then we make sure they don't find anything. Cole guided her back to the bed. Get some rest. I'll keep watch. This time, she didn't argue. She laid down, still fully dressed, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out. Cole returned to his post by the window. Outside, the night was quiet again, the kind of quiet that made you question whether you'd really seen anything at all. But Cole knew better than to trust that kind of quiet. Somewhere out there, 2 men were hunting, and whether they knew it yet or not, they'd just passed within striking distance of their quarry. The question now was whether they'd figure that out before it was too late. For them or for him and Lyra. Cole checked his rifle one more time and settled in to wait. The night was going to be long, and he had a feeling the days ahead were going to be longer still. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the numb acceptance of his own slow disappearance. He felt ready. Whatever came next, he'd face it. Not because he had to, but because somewhere between finding a stranger in his bed and watching her fight to stay alive, Cole Harlan had remembered what it meant to give a damn about something other than his own guilt. And that, he thought grimly, was either the best decision he'd made in years or the worst. Time would tell which. Dawn came with no sign of the riders returning. Cole had stayed awake through the night, his body running on the kind of alert exhaustion he remembered from his tracking days. When gray light finally started bleeding through the shutters, he allowed himself to step away from the window long enough to stoke the fire and put coffee on. Lyra stirred as the smell filled the cabin. She sat up slowly, wincing as her injured arm protested the movement. They come back? Her voice was rough with sleep. No. But their tracks are still out there, fresh enough to follow if we needed to. She swung her legs out of bed and stood, steadier than she'd been in days. Are you thinking about following them? Cole poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. Thinking about it. If we know where they're camped, we know where the threat is. Right now they could be anywhere. Or they could be gone entirely. Lyra wrapped her hands around the cup, absorbing its warmth. Maybe they decided I went a different direction. Maybe. Cole didn't sound convinced. But I've tracked enough people to know that hunters don't give up after one pass. They'll circle back, check areas they missed, especially if they think their quarry is close. Lyra took a sip of coffee and grimaced at the bitterness. So what do we do? We don't assume anything. We stay alert, we keep preparing, and we make sure we've got options if things go sideways. Cole moved back to the window and scanned the landscape. The morning light revealed nothing but snow and trees and the distant ridge where he'd found the tracks yesterday. How good are you with that rifle? Good enough to hit what I'm aiming at if it's not too far away. That'll work. Cole's turned back to her. Today we're going to make sure you can handle it under pressure. If shooting starts, I need to know you won't freeze up or shoot me by accident. A ghost of a smile crossed Lyra's face. I've managed to avoid shooting anyone so far. There's a first time for everything. Cole finished his coffee and set the cup down. Get dressed. We're going outside. They spent the morning in the clearing behind the cabin. Cole set up targets, pieces of wood propped against snowbanks, and walked Lyra through the basics of aimed fire. She was better than she'd claimed, her hands steady despite the cold, her breathing controlled. She'd definitely handled guns before. Where'd you learn to shoot? Cole asked after she'd put 3 rounds within inches of each other. My father taught me when I was young, before he died. Lyra lowered the rifle and ejected the spent shells. Said every person should know how to protect themselves because you can't always count on others to do it for you. Smart man. He was. She reloaded with practiced efficiency. Didn't help him much in the end. Heart gave out when I was 16. After that, it was just me and my sister. Cole heard something shift in her voice. Where's your sister now? Lyra's jaw tightened. Dead. The syndicate had her working in a different operation, laundry facility, 14-hour days in steam and chemicals. She got sick 2 years ago. They wouldn't pay for a doctor. Said she could work it off or quit, and quitting meant forfeiting the wages they already owed her. She raised the rifle again and fired, the shot going wide. She died 3 weeks later. That's when I started planning to run. Cole didn't offer sympathy. He'd learned that people who'd lost everything didn't want pity. They wanted acknowledgement, the simple recognition that their loss mattered. Your sister have a name? Mara. Lyra fired again, this time hitting center mass on the target. She was 23, should have had her whole life ahead of her. Yeah, she should have. They continued practicing until Lyra's hands started shaking from the cold. Cole called it then, and they headed back inside. He heated up leftover stew while Lyra cleaned both rifles, her movements methodical and careful. You're taking this seriously, she said after a while. Should I not be? No, I just mean, she paused, searching for words. Most people would have kicked me out by now, told me my problems aren't their problems, but you're treating this like it's a military operation. Cole stirred the pot. I told you, I used to track people for a living. You learn pretty quick that preparation is the difference between going home and going into the ground. Old habits. Is that all this is? Old habits? He turned to look at her. Lyra was watching him with that same measuring expression she'd worn the first night, like she was trying to figure out what made him tick. You want the truth? Cole asked. I wouldn't have asked otherwise. The truth is I spent 3 years trying to become nothing, trying to fade into this wilderness until there wasn't anything left of the person I used to be. It was working pretty well until you showed up. He poured stew into 2 bowls. Now I've got a reason to stay sharp. Maybe that makes me selfish. Maybe I'm just using your situation to feel useful again. I don't know, but I'm not doing this purely out of the goodness of my heart, if that's what you're asking. Lyra accepted the bowl he handed her. At least you're honest about it. Lying to yourself is how you end up dead. Cole sat down across from her. I learned that the hard way. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling through the gaps in the shutters. Cole found himself listening beneath the wind, alert for any sound that didn't belong. The riders might be gone, but they'd left their presence behind like a stain on the landscape. Tell me about your partner, Lyra said suddenly. The one who died? Cole's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Why? Because you blame yourself for it, and I want to understand why you're willing to help me when it clearly goes against every instinct you've developed since then. It was a fair question, even if Cole didn't particularly want to answer it. He set his spoon down and leaned back in his chair. His name was Daniel Reeves. We'd been working together for about 3 years when it happened. Good tracker, better shot than me, and he had a way of reading people that bordered on supernatural. Cole stared at the table. We were chasing a man named Garrett Finch. He'd killed 2 people in a robbery gone wrong and disappeared into the Bitterroots. We tracked him for 5 days, finally cornered him in a box canyon. Cole paused, the memory sharp enough to cut. Daniel wanted to wait him out. I wanted to go in fast, overwhelm him before he could dig in. We argued about it. Finally, I pulled rank, I was technically senior, and we went in my way. What happened? Finch had positioned himself perfectly. High ground, clear sight lines, plenty of ammunition. He hit Daniel with his first shot. Gut wound. Cole's voice went flat. I got Finch eventually, but it took too long. By the time I got back to Daniel, he was already gone. Took him maybe 20 minutes to bleed out, and there wasn't anything I could do about it. Lyra was quiet for a moment. And you think if you'd listened to him, he'd still be alive? I know if I'd listened to him, he'd still be alive. We would have waited. Finch would have run out of water or made a mistake, and we would have taken him clean, but I was impatient. Wanted the win more than I wanted to be smart about it. Cole met her eyes. So yeah, I blame myself because it was my fault. Did Daniel have family? A wife and a daughter. I went to see them after, tried to explain what happened. His wife told me she didn't want to hear it. Said nothing I could say would bring him back, so I might as well keep my apologies and my guilt to myself. Cole picked up his spoon again, but didn't eat. She was right, so I came out here to do exactly that. Lyra absorbed this. And now here I am, dragging you back into exactly the kind of situation that got him killed. No. Cole's voice was firm. This is different. Daniel died because I made a bad call in the heat of the moment. Whatever happens here, it'll be because we prepared for it and made our choices with clear heads. That's the difference. You really believe that? I have to. Cole finally took another bite of stew. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? Lyra didn't have an answer for that. They finished eating without further conversation, each lost in their own thoughts. Afterward, Cole returned to his watch by the window, while Lyra sat at the table and worked on repairing a tear in her coat with needle and thread she'd found in his supply box. The day dragged on. Cole fought to stay alert despite the exhaustion pulling at him. Around mid-afternoon, Lyra insisted on taking over the watch so he could sleep. He resisted at first, but she was right. He'd be useless if he collapsed from lack of rest. Wake me if anything changes, he said, settling onto the bed. Anything at all. I will. Cole closed his eyes, expecting sleep to take a while. Instead, he dropped off almost immediately, his body surrendering to the exhaustion he'd been holding at bay. He woke 4 hours later to the sound of Lyra's voice, low and urgent. Cole, we've got movement. He was on his feet instantly, crossing to the window where she stood. She pointed northwest, toward a stand of pines about 400 yards out. At first, Cole saw nothing. Then the trees shifted and he caught a glimpse of Brown, a horse, maybe 2. How long have they been there? He asked. Just appeared about 2 minutes ago. They're not moving, just waiting. Cole grabbed his spyglass and trained it on the trees. After a moment, he picked out 2 figures on horseback, partially concealed by the pines. They were facing the cabin, definitely watching. One of them raised his own spyglass and swept it across the clearing. Same 2 from last night? Lyra asked. Can't tell for sure, but probably. Cole lowered the spyglass. They know we're here. Question is what they're planning to do about it. As if in answer, one of the riders dismounted and started walking toward the cabin. He moved openly, hands visible and away from his weapons. The other rider stayed put, rifle across his saddle. That's a parley approach, Cole said. He wants to talk. It could be a trap. It could, but if they wanted to attack, they wouldn't announce themselves first. Cole moved to the door. Stay inside, keep your rifle ready. If this goes wrong, shoot through the window. Cole, I'm not planning on dying today, Lyra, but if I do, you make sure you take at least one of them with you before you run. He pulled on his coat and picked up his rifle. Understood? She nodded, her face pale but determined. Cole stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and clean. He walked to the middle of the clearing and stood waiting, rifle held casually but ready. The approaching man stopped about 30 feet away. He was maybe 40, weathered and hard-looking, with a scar running through his left eyebrow. He wore the kind of heavy coat men favored when they spent weeks at a time in the wilderness, and his boots were the military surplus Cole had identified from the tracks. "That's close enough," Cole called. The man raised his hand slightly. "Just here to talk, friend." "I'm not your friend. State your business." "Name's Keller. Thomas Keller. My partner over there is Ray Drummond. We're looking for someone, and we think she might have come through this area." "What makes you think that?" Keller smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We've been tracking her for a while now. Lost her trail a few days back, but we found signs that someone came through here recently. Someone small, moving fast, probably injured." He tilted his head. "You wouldn't happen to have seen anyone like that, would you?" Cole kept his expression neutral. "I see lots of things out here. Deer, elk, the occasional wolf. Haven't seen any people in weeks." "Is that right?" Keller's smile widened. "Because I'm looking at smoke from your chimney, and that's a lot of smoke for one man living alone. Makes me think you might have company." "Smoke's for warmth, not company." "Mind if we come inside and verify that?" "I mind very much." Cole shifted his grip on the rifle, just enough to make his point clear. "This is my land, my cabin, and you're not invited." Keller's smile finally faded. "Listen, friend. The woman we're looking for is property of the syndicate. She's a fugitive and a thief. We've got legal authority to bring her back, and anyone who harbors her is committing a crime. You got papers proving that authority?" "I've got something better." Keller gestured behind him. Drummond dismounted and pulled something from his saddlebag. Even from this distance, Cole could see it was a wanted poster. Drummond walked forward and handed it to Keller, who held it up. "Lyra Voss," Keller read. "Wanted for breach of contract, theft of syndicate property, and assault. Reward of $500 for her return, dead or alive." Cole took the poster and examined it. Sure enough, there was Lyra's face, rendered in crude ink but recognizable. The charges were as Keller had stated. What he didn't mention was that the poster had no official seal, no sheriff's signature, nothing that would make it legitimate law enforcement. "This isn't worth the paper it's printed on," Cole said, handing it back. "The syndicate can call her whatever they want, but that doesn't make it legal. Legal enough for our purposes." Keller tucked the poster away. "Look, I understand you're trying to protect your privacy out here. I respect that. But this woman is dangerous. She's hurt people, stolen from people who trusted her. If she's here, she's putting you at risk." "If she was here, I'd be able to handle my own risk." "I'm sure you would." Keller's voice took on a harder edge. "But the syndicate doesn't leave loose ends. They want her back, and they're going to get her back one way or another. You help us now, we'll make sure you get a cut of the reward. You don't help us, and we'll assume you're complicit. That won't end well for you." Cole met his eyes steadily. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." Keller glanced past him at the cabin. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Easy way, you tell us if she's here. We collect her and leave you in peace. Hard way, we come back with more men and search every inch of this property. Either way, we're not leaving without her." "Then I guess you're leaving without her." Cole raised his rifle, not quite pointing it at Keller, but making his intention clear. "Because she's not here, and you're not searching my property. Now get off my land before I decide you're trespassing with hostile intent." Keller stared at him for a long moment. Behind him, Drummond had moved his hand closer to his own rifle. The tension stretched thin and dangerous. Finally, Keller stepped back. "You're making a mistake. Won't be my first. Won't be my last. We'll be back. I'll be here." Keller turned and walked back to where Drummond waited. They mounted their horses without hurry, making a show of their lack of concern. But Cole noticed the way Drummond kept his hand near his rifle, the way both men kept the cabin in their peripheral vision as they rode away. They disappeared into the trees heading northeast. Cole stayed in the clearing for another 10 minutes, making sure they were really gone. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. Lyra had the door open before he reached it. Her face was tight with fear and anger. "I heard everything," she said. "They're not going to stop." "No, they're not." Cole stepped inside and barred the door. But we bought some time. They'll go back, report to whoever's running this operation, and wait for instructions. That gives us maybe a day, maybe two before they come back with reinforcements. A day or two to do what? To decide what we're doing. Cole set his rifle down and moved to the stove, suddenly needing coffee or whiskey or anything to cut through the adrenaline crash. They made their position clear. They're not leaving without you, so we either run or we fight. Lyra was quiet for a moment. If we run, they'll just keep hunting. They've got resources, connections. Eventually they'll find me again, and next time I might not find a cabin to hide in. Probably true. And if we fight? Cole poured water into the kettle. If we fight, we're committing to seeing this through to the end. That means killing or being killed. There's no middle ground once shooting starts. I know. Lyra sat down at the table. I've been running for 3 months, Cole. I'm tired. I'm so tired of looking over my shoulder, of jumping at every sound, of never being able to stay in one place long enough to feel human again. Running's hard. It's not just hard. It's eating me alive. She looked up at him. My sister died because she couldn't fight back, because she accepted what they told her, that she was property and there was nothing she could do about it. I swore when I ran that I wouldn't end up like her, that I'd rather die fighting than live on my knees. Cole let that sit between them. He understood the sentiment. He'd felt the same way when he'd walked away from his old life, though his fight had been with himself rather than with external enemies. Fighting doesn't guarantee winning, he said finally. No, but at least it's a choice. Lyra's eyes were hard. They took everything from me. My sister, my freedom, my future. The only thing I've got left is the ability to decide how this ends. And I'd rather end it here, on my terms, than spend the rest of my life running. Cole studied her. The frightened woman he'd found in his bed was gone, replaced by someone who'd burned through her fear and found something harder underneath. He recognized that transformation. He'd seen it in soldiers, in hunted animals, in himself. If we do this, he said slowly, we do it smart. We don't just make a stand and hope for the best. We prepare, we plan, and we stack every advantage we can in our favor. Agreed. And we accept that even if we do everything right, we might still lose. They've got numbers and resources. We've got terrain and surprise, but that only goes so far. I understand. Cole nodded. All right then. First thing we need to do is figure out how many men they're likely to bring back. Keller and Drummond, plus how many more? Lyra thought about it. The syndicate usually operates in groups of 5 or 6 for collection work. They don't like to invest more resources than necessary, but they also don't want to risk losing people to someone who fights back. So my guess is they'll come back with at least 3 more, maybe 4. 6 total then. Not great odds. Cole moved to the window and looked out at the landscape, his mind already working through possibilities. We can't hold the cabin against 6 armed men. Too many angles of approach, not enough defensible positions. So what do? We don't let them reach the cabin. Cole traced sightlines with his eyes. We choose the ground, set up ambush positions, and hit them before they know we're there. Make them commit to a fight on our terms, not theirs. You're talking about killing them. I'm talking about surviving. Cole turned back to her. You said you wanted to fight. This is what fighting looks like. It's not glorious or clean or fair. It's about doing what needs to be done before they do it to you. Lyra stood and walked to the other window. Outside, the sun was starting to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and red. When my sister died, I promised myself I'd make the syndicate pay for it. I just never knew what that would actually mean. It means blood, Cole said quietly. Theirs and maybe ours. It means living with the consequences if we survive. It means crossing a line you can't uncross. I crossed that line the day I ran. Lyra looked at him. I just didn't want to admit it until now. They stood in silence as the light faded outside. Cole felt the weight of the decision settling onto both of them like fresh snow, heavy and cold and inevitable. He'd sworn 3 years ago that he was done with violence, done with choices that got people killed. But here he was, planning an ambush that would almost certainly end in death. The difference, he told himself, was that this time he was choosing to fight for someone else's survival, not just his own pride or his own need to prove something. That had to count for something. Whether it counted enough to balance the scales Daniel Reeves' death had left uneven, he didn't know. But it was a start. We should eat something, Cole said, breaking the silence. Then we need to scout positions. If they're coming back tomorrow or the next day, we don't have time to waste. Lyra nodded. They prepared a quick meal of hardtack and dried meat, eating without tasting it. The food was fuel, nothing more. Afterward, Cole gathered his rifle, his spyglass, and extra ammunition. You're coming with me, he told Lyra. I need you to see the ground, understand the plan. If something happens to me, you'll need to execute it yourself. They bundled up against the cold and headed out into the gathering darkness. Cole led her along the most likely approach routes to the cabin, pointing out natural choke points, places where the terrain funneled movement, spots where a shooter could position themselves with good cover and clear sight lines. Here, he said, stopping at a cluster of boulders about 200 yards northwest of the cabin. This is where I'd set up if I were them. High ground, good view of the cabin, close enough to provide covering fire if someone approaches from the other side. So we hit them here first. No, we let them take this position, make them think they've got the advantage. Cole moved on, circling around to the east. The real ambush happens here. He showed her a narrow draw that cut between two low hills. Anyone approaching the cabin from the northeast, the direction Keller and Drummond had come from, would naturally funnel through this gap. We position ourselves on both sides, Cole explained. Wait for them to commit to the approach. Once they're in the draw, they can't retreat quickly and they can't spread out. We take out as many as we can before they realize what's happening. And if they don't come through the draw, then we adapt. But my guess is they'll use the same route they scouted. People are creatures of habit, especially when they think they've got the upper hand. They spent another hour identifying fallback positions, cache points for extra ammunition, and escape routes if everything went sideways. By the time they returned to the cabin, full dark had fallen, and the temperature had dropped enough that Cole's breath hung in the air like fog. Inside, Lyra lit a single candle, while Cole barred the door and shutters again. They moved carefully through the evening routine, both of them hyper-aware that this might be one of the last quiet nights they'd have. Get some sleep, Cole said eventually. I'll take first watch. I'm not sure I can sleep. Try anyway. You're going to need your strength. Lyra didn't argue. She lay down on the bed fully clothed, the Winchester within arm's reach. Cole settled into his chair by the window and prepared for another long night. Hours passed. The candle burned down to a stub, then guttered out. Cole sat in darkness, listening to the wind and Lyra's breathing and the countless small sounds of the cabin settling around him. His thoughts drifted between the past and the present, between Daniel's death and the fight to come, between the man he'd been and the man he was becoming again. Somewhere around midnight, Lyra's breathing changed. Cole glanced over and saw that she was awake, staring at the ceiling. Can't sleep? He asked quietly. No? She sat up. I keep thinking about my sister, about what she'd say if she knew what I was planning. What do you think she'd say? I don't know. Part of me thinks she'd tell me to run, to survive, that revenge isn't worth dying for. Lyra wrapped her arms around herself. But another part thinks she'd understand, that she'd want me to fight back, even if it costs me everything. Both things can be true. How do you live with that? With knowing that the people you've lost might not approve of the choices you're making because of them? Cole was quiet for a long moment. You don't live with it. You just keep moving forward and hope that eventually the weight gets lighter. Does it? Sometimes. Not always. He turned to look at her. Daniel's wife was right to hate me. I got her husband killed. But if I spend the rest of my life paralyzed by that guilt, then his death means nothing. So I try to make different choices, better choices, and hope that somewhere down the line it balances out. And does it? Ask me after tomorrow. Lyra almost smiled. Fair enough. She laid back down, and this time sleep seemed to find her. Cole returned to his watch, his mind sharp despite the exhaustion. Tomorrow or the next day, Keller and his men would return. And when they did, the careful isolation Cole had built for himself over 3 years would shatter completely. He'd spent so long trying to disappear that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to matter, to have someone depending on him, to face a fight that was about more than just survival. It terrified him. It also made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. Cole checked his rifle one more time and settled in to wait for dawn. Whatever was coming, he'd be ready. The sun broke cold and sharp over the ridge the next morning, turning the snow into fields of broken glass. Cole had been awake for 26 hours straight, his eyes gritty and his shoulders stiff from sitting in one position for too long. But his mind was clear. He'd passed through exhaustion into that strange state where everything felt heightened, every sound magnified, every shadow potentially significant. Lyra woke just after dawn and found him still at the window. She didn't ask if he'd slept. The answer was obvious. "Coffee?" she offered. "Yeah." She moved quietly to the stove, building up the fire and setting water to boil. Cole watched her work, noting the economy of her movements, the way she'd adapted to the cabin's limited space. A week ago, she'd been half dead in his bed. Now she moved like someone who belonged here, who'd claimed this small territory as her own. "Nothing overnight?" she asked, spooning grounds into the pot. "Nothing, but they'll come today. I can feel it." Lyra glanced at him. "You sound pretty sure." Keller's type doesn't waste time. He went back, reported the situation, and whoever's running this operation told him to finish it. They've had time to gather men and supplies. Any longer, and they risk losing momentum. The coffee finished brewing, and Lyra poured 2 cups. Cole accepted his gratefully, letting the heat seep into his hands before he drank. The bitter taste helped push back the fog in his head. "We should eat something substantial," Lyra said. "If today's the day, we need strength." She was right. Cole forced down a meal of fried salt pork and the last of their fresh bread, while Lyra checked and rechecked their weapons. She'd become meticulous about it over the past day, field stripping the Winchester and reassembling it twice already this morning. "You're going to wear out the mechanism," Cole said. "I need to know it'll work." "It'll work. You've cleaned it enough times to make sure of that." Lyra set the rifle down, but her hands kept moving, fingers drumming against her thigh. Nerves, Cole recognized. The waiting was always worse than the action. He'd seen plenty of men fall apart in the hours before a fight, their imaginations conjuring scenarios far worse than reality usually delivered. Of course, sometimes reality was worse. "Tell me again what I'm supposed to do," Lyra said. They'd been over it 3 times already, but Cole understood the need to hear it once more. Repetition built confidence, gave the mind something to hold on to when everything went to hell. "We move to the draw at first light. You take the eastern position, I take the west. We stay low, stay quiet, and we wait. When they come through, if they come through, you let me fire first. I'll take the lead rider. You take whoever's behind him on your side. Aim for center mass, don't try for headshots. If you miss, work the bolt and fire again. Keep firing until they're down or they've retreated out of range. And if they don't come through the draw, then we fall back to position 2, the boulder cluster. Same principle, different angle. We've got the high ground and we know the terrain. They don't. And if that doesn't work?" Cole met her eyes. "Then we run. There's no shame in knowing when you're beaten, Lyra. Dying for pride is stupidity, not courage." She nodded slowly. "I won't run unless you do." "That's not—" "I mean it." Her voice was firm. "We're in this together, whatever happens." Cole wanted to argue, to tell her that his life mattered less than hers, that he'd already wasted 3 years hiding from himself while she still had a future worth fighting for. But he recognized the set of her jaw, the determination in her eyes. She'd made her choice, and she wouldn't be moved. "All right," he said, "together." They finished their preparations in silence. Extra ammunition distributed between their pockets, knives sharpened and secured, canteens filled despite the cold. If they ended up pinned down, they'd need water. Cole took one last look around the cabin, committing it to memory. If things went wrong, he might never see it again. The thought didn't bother him as much as he expected. They left just as full light broke across the landscape. The walk to the draw took 15 minutes, both of them moving carefully to avoid leaving obvious tracks. When they reached the position, Cole directed Lyra to her spot behind a fallen log on the eastern side, while he took up position in a cluster of rocks to the west. The draw stretched out between them, maybe 30 yards wide at its narrowest point. Anyone coming through would be exposed for a good 10 seconds, long enough for accurate shooting if they kept their nerve. Cole settled in and began the wait. An hour passed, then 2. The cold seeped through Cole's coat despite the layers. Beside him, packed in snow, were the extra rounds he'd cached last night. He counted them by touch without looking, his eyes fixed on the northern end of the draw where the riders would appear. If they appeared. Doubt crept in as the 3rd hour began. Maybe Keller had decided it wasn't worth it. Maybe the syndicate had bigger problems to deal with. Maybe they'd given up on Lyra entirely and moved on to easier prey. Cole almost believed it. Then he saw movement. 4 riders came around the bend, moving in a loose formation with Keller in the lead. Cole recognized Drummond riding second. The other 2 were strangers, both big men with rifles slung across their backs, and the casual confidence of people who'd done this kind of work before. 4, not 6. Either Lyra had miscalculated or the syndicate was being cautious with their resources. Either way, it didn't change the math much. 4 trained men were still more than enough to kill 2 people in an ambush if things went wrong. Cole sighted down his rifle, tracking Keller as the group entered the draw. His heart rate stayed steady, his breathing even. The old training was coming back, muscle memory overriding 3 years of rust. He felt Lyra's presence across the gap, invisible but there, waiting for his shot. Keller rode deeper into the draw, 20 yards, 15, 10. Cole's finger tightened on the trigger. Then Keller raised his hand and the group stopped. Cole's breath caught. Keller was looking around, his head turning slowly as he scanned the ridge lines. His horse stamped and shifted, picking up on its rider's tension. "Something's wrong," Keller called out. His voice carried clearly in the cold air. "Drummond, you feel that?" Drummond had already drawn his rifle. "Yeah, we're being watched." One of the other riders, a lean man with a scarred face, spat into the snow. "You're getting spooked by nothing. There's no one out here." "Maybe." Keller's hand rested on his own rifle. "Or maybe our friend from yesterday decided to set a trap." Cole's mind raced. They'd stopped too soon, hadn't committed fully to the kill zone. If he fired now, he'd get Keller, but the others would scatter before Lyra could take her shot. They'd lose the element of surprise and end up in exactly the kind of drawn-out fight they couldn't win. But if he waited, if he let them retreat, they'd know the ambush was here. They'd come back prepared, probably circle around and hit the cabin from a different angle. Neither option was good. Keller made the decision for him. Back up, slow and easy. Something feels wrong about this. The riders started to reverse, their horses moving carefully on the snow-packed ground. Cole watched his advantage dissolving. In another 30 seconds, they'd be out of the draw entirely, back in open ground, where they could spread out and search properly. He had to take the shot. Cole squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder and Keller jerked backward, blood blooming across his coat. He fell from his horse, hitting the snow hard. The other 3 riders exploded into motion. Lyra fired, the crack of her Winchester echoing off the hills. One of the strangers clutched his side and nearly fell from his saddle, but held on. Drummond wheeled his horse and charged toward Cole's position, firing wildly. The lean man yanked his horse around and spurred for the mouth of the draw. Cole worked his bolt and fired again, aiming for Drummond. The shot went wide, kicking up snow 2 feet to the left. Drummond was closing fast, still firing. Cole heard bullets whining off the rocks around him. Across the draw, Lyra fired twice more in quick succession. The wounded man slumped in his saddle and toppled off his horse. The animal bolted, disappearing back the way they'd come. Drummond reached Cole's position and drove his horse straight at the rocks. Cole rolled aside as hooves crashed down where he'd been lying. He came up with his rifle, but Drummond was already past, circling around for another charge. The lean man had made it out of the draw and was laying down covering fire from a safe distance. His shots were more accurate than Drummond's wild spraying. Rock chips exploded near Cole's head, and he ducked instinctively. Cole caught a glimpse of Lyra changing position, moving along the ridgeline to get an angle on the lean man. She fired and missed, fired again, and hit the man's horse. The animal screamed and went down, throwing its rider into a snowbank. Drummond came around for another charge. This time Cole was ready. He stood and fired from the hip as the horse bore down on him. The bullet caught Drummond high in the chest and he flew backward out of his saddle. His horse, panicked by the gunfire and the smell of blood, kept running. Cole worked his bolt, ejecting the spent shell, and turned toward where the lean man had gone down. The man was on his feet, limping but moving, trying to reach the cover of some pines. Lyra fired and the man dropped, clutching his leg. Then silence. Just the wind and the ringing in Cole's ears and his own harsh breathing. Cole scanned the draw. Keller was motionless in the snow, a dark stain spreading around him. The stranger Lyra had shot first was also still, his eyes open and empty. Drummond was crawling, one hand pressed against his chest, leaving a trail of red behind him. The lean man was down behind a snowbank, out of Cole's line of sight. Cole moved carefully toward Drummond, rifle ready. The man looked up as Cole approached, his face pale and twisted with pain. "You're done," Drummond said. Blood bubbled at his lips. "Syndicate doesn't forget, doesn't forgive." "Neither do I," Cole said. Drummond tried to laugh, but it came out as a wet cough. "She worth dying for?" Cole didn't answer. He watched as Drummond's breathing grew shallower, the light in his eyes dimming. It took maybe 2 minutes. Then Drummond was gone, just another body cooling in the snow. Across the draw, Lyra appeared on the ridgeline. She was moving toward where the lean man had fallen. Cole called out to her. "Careful! He might still be armed!" Lyra approached the snowbank with her rifle raised. She disappeared behind it for a moment, then reappeared and waved. "He's dead! Bled out!" Cole let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. 4 riders, 4 bodies. They'd won. It didn't feel like winning. Lyra made her way down from the ridge and joined him in the draw. Her face was spattered with gunpowder residue, and her hands were shaking, but her eyes were clear. "You hit?" Cole asked. "No. You?" "No." Cole looked at the carnage around them. "We need to check them, make sure they're all dead. Then we need to search them for anything useful." They moved methodically from body to body. Keller had died instantly, Cole's bullet having punched through his heart. The first stranger Lyra shot had taken 2 rounds in the chest. Drummond and the lean man were as they'd left them. All 4 were carrying syndicate identification papers, some money, and ammunition that matched their weapons. Cole found something else in Keller's coat pocket, a folded map with several locations marked in pencil, including the area around the cabin. Other marks indicated towns and what looked like syndicate outposts. He pocketed it for later examination. "What do we do with the bodies?" Lyra asked. It was a practical question. 4 dead men couldn't be left in the open. Animals would scatter the remains and eventually someone would find them. Better to control the narrative while they could. "We'll bury them," Cole said. "Ground's frozen, but there's a ravine about half a mile east. We can stack them there and cover them with rocks and snow. Won't be permanent, but it'll do until spring." "That's a lot of work." "Yeah." Cole looked at the sky. Still several hours of daylight left. "But we can't leave them here." They started with Keller, the closest body. It took both of them to drag him to where they'd hobbled the horses. The animals had scattered during the shooting, but hadn't gone far. They loaded Keller across one saddle and moved on to the next body. It was brutal, exhausting work. The bodies were heavy and awkward, dead weight that fought them with every step. By the time they'd collected all 4 and led the horses to the ravine, Cole's back was screaming and his hands were numb despite his gloves. The ravine was a natural crack in the landscape, maybe 20 feet deep with steep sides. They tumbled the bodies down into it one by one, then spent another hour carrying rocks and branches to cover them. It wasn't a proper burial, but it was more than men like this deserved. When they finished, the sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon. Cole stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down at their work. 4 men had ridden out this morning expecting an easy collection. Now they were stacked in a frozen grave. Their mission failed and their employer none the wiser. "You think there'll be more?" Lyra asked beside him. "Eventually. When these 4 don't report back, the syndicate will send someone to investigate. But that could take weeks, maybe months. By then, the trail will be cold." "So we just wait for them to come?" Cole shook his head. "No. We make sure they don't have a reason to come." They rode the horses back to the cabin as darkness fell. The animals were valuable, good stock, well cared for. The saddles and tack were quality equipment. Everything could be sold or traded, though they'd have to be careful about it. 4 horses appearing all at once would raise questions. Back at the cabin, they unsaddled the animals and settled them in the lean-to with Cole's own horse. It was crowded, but manageable. Cole noted the brands on their flanks, different marks from different territories. Stolen or purchased, it was impossible to say. Inside, Lyra collapsed into a chair while Cole built up the fire. Neither of them had eaten since morning, and the work had burned through whatever reserves they'd had left. Cole heated up the last of the stew, and they ate in silence, too tired to talk. Afterward, Lyra cleaned the rifles while Cole examined the map he'd taken from Keller. The marks made more sense now that he had time to study them. The syndicate's network was extensive, spreading across 3 territories with connections to legitimate businesses and local officials. The mark near his cabin was labeled Voss Probable, with a date from 2 days ago. "They were fairly sure you were here, Cole said, showing Lyra the map. Probably had information from someone who'd seen you in the area. Lyra studied it. These other marks, are those all syndicate operations? Looks like it. Labor camps, collection points, storage facilities. Cole traced the routes between them. It's bigger than I thought. They've got their hands in everything from timber to mining to transportation. And they'll send more people when these 4 don't come back. Probably. Cole folded the map. But we've got something now we didn't have before. What's that? Information. He tapped the map. This tells us where they operate, how they move, who they've got in their pocket. That's leverage. And leverage is how you survive when you're outgunned. Lyra looked at him. You're thinking about going after them. I'm thinking about making sure they don't come after us. There's a difference. Is there? She leaned back in her chair. Because it sounds like you're planning to start a war. I'm planning to end one before it starts. Cole met her eyes. The syndicate left you alone before because you weren't worth the trouble. Now you've cost them 4 men and exposed their network. They can't let that stand. So we make it clear that coming after you costs more than it's worth. How do we do that? We hit them where it hurts. Their money, their operations, their reputation. Cole spread the map on the table. We make them bleed until they decide you're not worth chasing. Lyra stared at the map for a long moment. That's not just fighting back. That's declaring war. Yeah, it is. And you're willing to do that? Cole thought about it. A week ago, the answer would have been no. A week ago, he'd been perfectly content to let the world forget he existed. But things had changed. He'd changed. Or maybe he'd just remembered who he used to be before guilt and isolation had worn him down to nothing. I'm willing, he said. Question is, are you? Lyra traced one of the marks on the map with her finger. It was labeled Helena Distribution and dated from 3 weeks ago. My sister died because she had no power and no one willing to fight for her. I swore I'd never be that helpless again. That's not an answer. Yes, Lyra said quietly. I'm willing. Cole nodded. He'd expected nothing less, but hearing her say it still carried weight. They were committed now, locked into a course of action that would either free them or kill them. Probably both, eventually. They spent the rest of the evening planning. The map provided targets, but they needed more information about timing, security, and which operations were most vulnerable. Cole suggested they start with reconnaissance, watching the nearest syndicate location to learn its patterns. That's the timber operation outside Blackwood Creek, he said, pointing to a mark 40 miles southwest. Close enough that we can reach it and get back in a few days, but far enough that they won't connect it to what happened here right away. What happens after we scout it? We decide if it's worth hitting. If it is, we plan the operation. If it's not, we move on to the next target. Cole looked up from the map. This isn't going to be fast, Lyra. We'll need to be patient, methodical. One mistake and we're done. I understand. Do you? Cole's voice was harder than he intended. Because once we start this, there's no going back. Every person we hurt, every operation we disrupt, we're painting a target on our backs that gets bigger and brighter. Eventually, they'll throw enough resources at us that patience and planning won't be enough. Then we make every hit count before that happens. Lyra's expression was calm. I'm not naive, Cole. I know this probably ends badly for us, but at least it'll be our choice how it ends. That matters. Cole couldn't argue with that. Choice was all anyone really had, in the end. Everything else was just consequences. They turned in early, exhaustion finally catching up with them. Cole took the bed and insisted Lyra take the first watch despite her protests. He fell asleep almost immediately, his body surrendering to the accumulated fatigue of the past 2 days. He woke sometime after midnight to find Lyra still awake, sitting by the window with the rifle across her lap. She was staring out at the darkness, her expression distant. Your shift ended hours ago, Cole said, his voice rough with sleep. I know, couldn't sleep. Cole sat up. Bad dreams? No dreams, just thinking. About? Lyra was quiet for a moment. About whether my sister would recognize me now, whether she'd be proud or horrified by what I'm becoming. Cole knew that feeling. He'd spent 3 years wondering the same thing about Daniel. People change when circumstances force them to. That doesn't make them unrecognizable, just different. Is that what you tell yourself? It's what I've learned. Cole stood and crossed to the window, looking out at the same darkness Lyra had been watching. The man I was when Daniel was alive thought he had everything figured out, thought confidence and quick decisions were all you needed to survive. That man got his partner killed. And the man you are now? I don't know yet. Still figuring that out. Cole glanced at her. But I know I'm not going to let anyone else die because I was too slow or too cautious or too afraid to do what needed doing. That has to count for something. Lyra nodded slowly. We're a pair, aren't we? Both trying to make up for people we couldn't save. Maybe that's all anyone's doing, just trying to balance the scales before their own time runs out. They stood together in silence, watching the snow-covered landscape gradually lighten as dawn approached. Somewhere out there, the syndicate was continuing its operations, unaware that 4 of its men were dead and that 2 people they'd written off as easy prey were now planning to come for them. Cole felt the weight of what they were about to do settling onto his shoulders. It was familiar, that weight. He'd carried it before, during his years of tracking and hunting, but this time it felt different. Less about pride or proving something and more about simple necessity. They'd been backed into a corner with no good option, so they were making their own option out of whatever materials they had. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start with. We should try to get a few more hours of sleep, Cole said finally. Tomorrow we start preparing for the trip to Blackwood Creek. That means organizing supplies, making sure the horses are ready, and working out our cover story if anyone asks questions. What's our cover story? You're my wife. We're headed to visit your family in Helena, and we're stopping to sell some furs along the way. Simple, believable, and it explains why we're traveling together. Lyra raised an eyebrow. Your wife? You have a better idea? No, I suppose not. She smiled faintly. Though I should probably know my husband's full name if we're going to be convincing. Cole Marcus Harlan, born in Missouri, moved west when I was 19, worked as a tracker and bounty hunter until I decided I preferred solitude. And my name is still Lyra Voss? No, too risky if someone's seen those wanted posters. You're Lyra Harlan now, born in Kansas, married me 2 years ago, miss your family terribly, and insist on visiting them despite the weather. Lyra tested it out. Lyra Harlan, it sounds strange. It'll sound natural by the time we reach Blackwood Creek. Cole moved toward the bed. Get some rest. We've got a long few days ahead of us. This time Lyra didn't argue. She settled into the chair Cole had vacated while he stretched out on the bed. Sleep came slower this time, his mind too active to fully surrender. But eventually the exhaustion won, and he drifted off to the sound of wind against the shutters and the quiet presence of someone keeping watch. When he woke again, full morning light was streaming through the gaps in the shutters, and Lyra was asleep in the chair, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. Cole stood quietly and covered her with a blanket, careful not to wake her. She needed the rest more than she probably realized. Outside, he checked on the horses and found them settled and calm. The extra mounts were good stock, sturdy and well-trained. They'd fetch a decent price if sold carefully, or they could be useful for carrying supplies and equipment if the work ahead required it. Cole spent the morning organizing their gear. They'd need to travel light but prepared, carrying enough to survive several days on the trail while not looking like they were running from something. It was a balance he'd struck many times before, though never under quite these circumstances. Around mid-morning, Lyra emerged from the cabin, looking more rested but still carrying the tension of the past few days in her shoulders. How are the horses? She asked. Good. The extra ones are quality animals. Syndicate knows how to equip their people. I'll give them that. How much do you think they're worth? Together? Maybe $300 if we find the right buyer. But selling all 4 at once will raise questions we don't want to answer. So we keep them? For now, they'll be useful for what we're planning. Cole closed the saddlebag he'd been packing. How's your arm? Lyra flexed it experimentally. Sore but functional. The stitches are holding. Good, because the ride to Blackwood Creek will be hard and we can't afford for you to be weak when we get there. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Food, ammunition, cold weather gear, everything they'd need for a week-long expedition into uncertain territory. Cole also went through the items they'd taken from the dead riders, separating what was useful from what was just weight. The syndicate papers were interesting. Each man had carried official-looking documents claiming they were authorized to conduct collections and enforce contracts on behalf of various mining and timber operations. It was legitimacy purchased through corruption, but effective nonetheless. They had legal cover, Lyra said, reading over his shoulder. Anyone who resisted them would have been breaking the law, at least on paper. That's how the syndicate works. They don't just use force, they use the system, twist it until what's illegal becomes legal and what's legal becomes impossible. Cole set the papers aside. That's why hitting them is going to be tricky. We can't just burn down a building and walk away. We need to be smart about it. So what's the plan? First we scout, learn the patterns, identify weaknesses, then we decide what kind of damage we can do without getting caught. Cole looked at her. This isn't about revenge, Lyra. It's about survival. We hurt them enough that they decide leaving us alone is easier than hunting us. That's all. And if they don't make that decision, then we keep hitting them until they do, or until we run out of options. It wasn't a great plan. Cole knew that. But it was better than sitting in the cabin waiting for the next group of hunters to arrive. At least this way they'd be taking action, controlling their own fate rather than reacting to threats as they appeared. That night they ate well, knowing it might be the last hot meal they'd have for a while. Cole had shot a deer 2 days before the riders arrived, and the meat had been aging in the cold. Lyra roasted it over the fire while Cole cleaned and oiled their weapons one final time. "When do we leave?" Lyra asked. "Tomorrow at first light. The trip will take 2 days if the weather holds, maybe 3 if we hit storms. We'll approach Blackwood Creek from the east, camp outside town, and spend a day or 2 watching the timber operation before we make any decisions. And if someone recognizes me, they won't. You look different than you did 3 months ago, thinner, harder. And you'll be playing the role of a rancher's wife, not a fugitive. People see what they expect to see." Lyra nodded, but Cole could see the worry in her eyes. She was right to be worried. This was dangerous, maybe more dangerous than the fight in the draw. At least there they'd known who the enemy was and where they stood. In Blackwood Creek, they'd be surrounded by potential threats with no easy way to tell friend from foe. But it had to be done. They couldn't keep reacting, couldn't keep waiting for the syndicate to make the next move. So if they were going to survive long term, they needed to take control of the situation, even if that control was fragile and temporary. They turned in early again, both of them needing rest before the journey ahead. Cole lay awake for a while, listening to Lyra's breathing, even out into sleep, and thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. There were so many variables, so many things outside their control, but dwelling on them wouldn't change anything. So Cole pushed the thoughts aside and focused on what he could control: his preparation, his training, his willingness to do whatever was necessary to see this through. Tomorrow they'd ride out. Tomorrow they'd start down a road that had no clear end and no guaranteed survival. But it was their road, chosen freely rather than forced on them by circumstance or fear. And that, Cole thought, as sleep finally claimed him, made all the difference. They rode out before the sun cleared the ridge, 2 figures on horseback leading a pack horse loaded with supplies and furs. The morning was bitter cold, the kind that made your lungs ache with each breath and turned exposed skin raw within minutes. Cole led the way with Lyra riding close behind, both of them scanning the landscape for any sign of trouble. The first day passed without incident. They followed game trails and old logging roads, avoiding the main routes where they might encounter other travelers. Cole set a steady pace, not pushing the horses but not dawdling either. By the time they made camp that evening, they'd covered nearly 20 miles. Cole chose a sheltered spot in a stand of pines where the trees blocked the worst of the wind. They built a small fire, just enough to heat coffee and warm their hands, and ate cold rations from their packs. Talking felt dangerous out here, like it might carry farther than they intended, so they kept conversation to a minimum. "How's your arm holding up?" Cole asked as they settled in for the night. "Stiff, but it's not bleeding again." Lyra flexed her fingers. "I can still shoot if I need to." "Let's hope you don't need to." They took turns on watch through the night. When Cole's turn came around midnight, he sat with his back against a tree and listened to the wilderness sounds around him. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Closer by, something moved through the underbrush. Probably a fox or raccoon. Normal sounds. Nothing that suggested human presence. Still, Cole didn't relax. The syndicate might not know where they were going, but that didn't mean the wilderness was safe. There were plenty of other dangers out here beyond organized criminals. Morning came gray and threatening. Cole studied the clouds and decided they had maybe 6 hours before snow started falling. They broke camp quickly and pushed harder, trying to make up time before the weather turned. The horses sensed the urgency and moved faster without complaint. They reached the outskirts of Blackwood Creek just as the first flakes started to fall. The town was bigger than Cole expected, maybe 300 people spread across a main street and several side roads. The timber operation sat on the eastern edge, a sprawling complex of mill buildings, storage sheds, and worker barracks. Cole led them past the operation without slowing, heading instead for a spot he'd identified on the map about 2 miles north. It was an old homestead, abandoned from the look of it, with a half-collapsed barn and a cabin that had seen better days. "We're staying here?" Lyra asked as they dismounted. "Just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll move closer, find a better vantage point to watch the operation." The cabin was in rough shape, but the roof was mostly intact, and the walls blocked the wind. Cole cleared out the worst of the debris while Lyra tended to the horses in what remained of the barn. By the time full dark fell, they had a small fire going and had laid out their bedrolls in the least drafty corner. "Tell me what we're looking for," Lyra said as they ate. "Patterns. How many workers? How many guards? When they come and go, where they're vulnerable. Supply deliveries, shift changes, weak points in their security." Cole chewed a piece of hardtack. "The syndicate runs these operations on routine. Break the routine and you break the operation." "And we're breaking it how?" "Haven't decided yet. Depends on what we see tomorrow." The snow fell steadily through the night, muffling all sound. Cole slept lightly, one hand on his rifle, and woke several times to check that the fire hadn't died completely. Each time he found Lyra awake too, her eyes reflecting the dim firelight. They were both wound too tight to rest properly. Morning brought 6 inches of fresh snow and a sky that promised more to come. Cole and Lyra ate quickly, then left the horses in the barn and set out on foot. The timber operation was easy to approach through the woods, the falling snow providing natural cover. They found a position on a low hill, about 300 yards from the main mill building. From here they could see the entire complex without being obvious themselves. Cole pulled out his spyglass and began a methodical survey. The operation was active despite the weather. Workers moved between buildings, some hauling lumber, others manning the saw equipment. Cole counted maybe 40 men total, though it was hard to be certain with people moving in and out of structures. What interested him more were the 3 men who weren't working. They stood near the main gate, rifles slung over their shoulders, watching the workers with the casual alertness of guards who'd done this job too long to be surprised by anything. One of them wore a coat similar to what Keller had worn. Syndicate men, almost certainly. 3 guards, Cole said quietly, handing the spyglass to Lyra. "Maybe more inside the buildings we can't see." Lyra studied the complex. "The workers don't look happy." She was right. The men moving lumber did so with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd given up on finding joy in their work. No talking, no joking around, just grim repetition. Cole had seen that look before in labor camps and prison work details. "They're probably trapped the same way you were," he said. "Debt, contracts, promises that turned into chains." "So if we hit this place, we're not just hurting the syndicate, we're freeing these people." "Maybe. Or maybe we're just putting them out of work and making their lives harder." Cole took the spyglass back. "Don't romanticize what we're doing, Lyra. This isn't about justice, it's about survival." "Can it be both?" Cole didn't answer. He returned to watching the operation, noting the patterns Lyra had asked about. Around mid-morning, a wagon arrived loaded with supplies. The guards checked the driver's papers before waving him through. An hour later, the workers broke for a meal, filing into one of the barracks buildings. "The guards don't eat with them," Lyra observed. "No. They rotate. One stays at the gate while the other 2 take turns going inside that smaller building, probably an office or supervisor's quarters." They watched through the afternoon, freezing despite their heavy coats. The patterns became clear. 2 shift changes, one at noon and one at dusk. During the changes, there was a brief window where the guards were distracted, focused on the handoff rather than on perimeter security. As the light began to fail, Cole motioned for them to pull back. They made their way carefully through the woods, their tracks already being filled by the continuing snowfall. Back at the abandoned homestead, they huddled close to the fire while Cole sketched out what they'd seen on a piece of paper. "The shift change is our best opportunity," he said, marking the gate area. 3 minutes, maybe 4, where their attention is divided. If we're going to do something, that's when. "Do what, exactly?" Cole sat back. "That's the question. We could burn down one of the storage sheds. Disrupts their operation, costs them money. But it's also obvious sabotage, and it puts the workers at risk if the fire spreads. What else? We could hit the payroll. These operations run on cash, especially in places this remote. They've got to have money somewhere to pay the workers and the suppliers. That helps us, but doesn't hurt them much long term. No, Cole agreed, but it gives us resources to keep moving, keep fighting, and it sends a message that we can get inside their operations. Lyra studied the rough sketch. What about the guards? If we go in, we'll have to deal with them. Probably. Which is why I'm still not sure this is the right move. Cole set the pencil down. Every person we hurt makes the syndicate angrier, more determined to find us. There's a balance we need to strike between hitting them hard enough to matter and not hitting them so hard they throw everything they have at us. Sounds like you're having second thoughts. I'm having realistic thoughts. Cole looked at her. This isn't a game, Lyra. We kill more of their people, they'll escalate. Eventually they'll bring in enough men and enough guns that all our planning and all our advantages won't matter. We need to be smart about when we push and when we pull back. So what are you saying? We came all this way just to watch and leave? I'm saying we gather information and make an informed decision instead of rushing in because we're angry or scared. Cole's voice was firm. You wanted to fight? Fine. But fighting means thinking, not just shooting. Lyra's jaw tightened, but she nodded. All right, so we watch more, learn more, then decide. They spent another day observing the operation. The patterns held consistent. 3 guards in rotation, workers moving through their shifts like machines, supply wagons coming and going on a predictable schedule. Cole noted everything, building a mental map of the complex and its vulnerabilities. On the 3rd day, something changed. A group of riders arrived around noon, 5 men on good horses with the look of people who expected to be obeyed. The guards at the gate straightened up immediately, their casual alertness sharpening into something more formal. One of them hurried to the office building while the riders dismounted. Cole trained his spyglass on the group. The lead rider was a tall man in his 50s, gray-haired and hard-faced. He wore a long coat that Cole recognized as expensive even from this distance. The other 4 were clearly his security, positioned to watch different approaches while their boss conducted his business. Who is that? Lyra whispered. Someone important. Maybe regional management for the syndicate. Cole watched as the tall man entered the office building, 2 of his security following while the other 2 stayed with the horses. The visit lasted maybe an hour. When the tall man emerged, he was accompanied by someone else, a younger man in clerk's clothes carrying a leather satchel. They spoke briefly, the tall man gesturing toward different parts of the operation while the clerk took notes. Then they mounted up and rode out, heading west toward Blackwood Creek proper. That satchel, Lyra said. Could be the payroll. Could be. Cole lowered the spyglass. Or could be records, contracts, anything. We don't know. But if we followed them, we'd be leaving our position and exposing ourselves. Not worth the risk just to satisfy curiosity. Lyra looked like she wanted to argue, but held her tongue. Cole understood her frustration. They'd been watching for 3 days, and all they had to show for it was information. No action, no progress toward their goal of making the syndicate back off. But action without proper planning was suicide. Cole had learned that lesson the hard way. That evening, as they prepared to head back to the abandoned homestead, Cole made a decision. We're leaving tomorrow, he said. Lyra turned to him. Why? We finally saw something useful. Exactly. We saw management visiting, which means they're paying attention to this operation. That makes it the wrong target. We hit this place and we're hitting something they care about, something they'll investigate thoroughly. Better to find a smaller operation, something they'll write off as bad luck rather than enemy action. So all of this was for nothing? No. We learned how they operate, what their security looks like, how they rotate personnel. That applies to every operation they run, not just this one. Cole started back toward the trees. Information is never wasted, Lyra. It just takes time to see how to use it. They made it back to the homestead as darkness fell. Cole felt the weight of Lyra's disappointment even though she didn't voice it. She'd wanted action, wanted to strike back at the organization that had taken everything from her. Instead, all she'd gotten was cold, hunger, and 3 days of watching from a distance. But that was how you survived when you were outnumbered and outgunned. Patience. Discipline. The willingness to walk away when the risk outweighed the reward. Cole hoped she'd understand that eventually. They left before dawn the next morning. retracing their route back toward the cabin. The return journey was harder than the outbound trip. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees and the snow was deeper, slowing the horses. Cole pushed them as hard as he dared, wanting to get home before the weather got worse. They were about 10 miles from the cabin when Cole spotted smoke on the horizon. He pulled up sharply, raising his hand to stop Lyra. She rode up beside him, following his gaze. "That's coming from the direction of the cabin," she said quietly. "Yeah." Cole's mind raced through possibilities. Could be a natural fire, a lightning strike, or a spark from the chimney. Could be travelers taking shelter and building up the fire without realizing how much smoke they were producing. Could be a lot of innocent things, but Cole didn't believe in innocent things anymore. "We approach carefully," he said. "Stay behind me, keep your rifle ready. If I signal you to run, you run, and don't look back." "Cole, I mean it, Lyra. You run and you keep running until you're somewhere safe. Don't try to be a hero." She didn't agree, but she didn't argue either. They moved forward at a cautious pace, both of them alert for any sign of trouble. As they got closer, the smell of smoke grew stronger. Not wood smoke, Cole realized. Something else. Something that smelled like burning fabric and leather. They found the cabin from the ridge overlooking it, or what was left of the cabin. The structure was a smoking ruin. The roof collapsed and the walls reduced to charred timber. The lean-to where they'd kept the horses was also destroyed. Everything was gone, burned to the ground with a thoroughness that suggested intention rather than accident. Cole sat his horse in silence, staring at the destruction. Behind him, he heard Lyra's sharp intake of breath. "They found it," she said. "Yeah." "While we were gone, they came here and burned everything." "Yeah." Cole's voice was flat, emotionless. Inside, though, he felt something cold and hard settling into place. The cabin had been his refuge for 3 years, his escape from the world and from himself. Now it was ash. They rode down for a closer look, though Cole already knew what they'd find. The fire had been set deliberately, probably with accelerant. Someone had made sure nothing would survive. Whoever had done this wanted to send a message. "We can reach you anywhere." Lyra dismounted and walked through the ruins, her boots crunching on charred wood. Cole stayed on his horse, surveying the surrounding area. The tracks were clear despite the snow. 4 riders, maybe 5, had come from the northeast. They'd stayed maybe an hour, long enough to search the cabin and set the fire. Then they'd ridden out heading west. "Looking for us," Cole said. "When they didn't find us here, they burned it and moved on." "Where?" Lyra's voice was tight with anger. "Probably Blackwood Creek. They'll check the town, ask questions, see if anyone's seen a man and woman traveling together." Cole turned his horse. "We need to move. If they're headed west and we're coming from the west, we might cross paths." "Let them come." Lyra's hands were clenched into fists. "I'm done running." "We're not running. We're being smart." Cole rode over to her. "They burned a cabin, that's all. We're still alive, still free, and now we know they're actively hunting. That's valuable information." "It was your home." "It was 4 walls and a roof." The lie came easily. "I can build another one." Lyra looked at him, and Cole knew she saw through the words, but she also saw that he meant what he said about moving. She mounted up and they turned their horses north, away from the cabin and away from the likely path of the riders who'd destroyed it. They rode hard for 2 hours, putting distance between themselves and the ruins. When they finally stopped to rest the horses, they were in country Cole didn't know well, high ridges and narrow valleys that would make tracking difficult. "Where are we going?" Lyra asked. "I don't know yet. Somewhere they won't think to look." Cole studied the terrain. The map showed a few other small settlements north of here. "We'll head that direction, find somewhere to lay low while we figure out our next move." "Our next move should be hitting them back. Hard." "Maybe." Cole dismounted to check his horse's hooves. "But first we survive the next few days. Then we can talk about hitting back." They made camp that night in a ravine that offered shelter from the wind and some concealment from anyone passing nearby. Cole built no fire, not wanting to risk the smoke giving them away. They ate cold food and huddled together for warmth as the temperature continued to drop. "I'm sorry," Lyra said quietly. "About the cabin." "Not your fault?" "It is, though. If I hadn't shown up, you'd still have your home. You'd still be safe." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I spent 3 years in that cabin trying to become nothing, trying to let the world forget I existed. You know what I learned? What? That being nothing is its own kind of death. Slower than a bullet, but just as final. He shifted, trying to find a position that didn't leave him completely exposed to the cold. So yeah, I lost the cabin, but I also remembered what it feels like to matter, to have something worth fighting for. I'd call that a fair trade. You really believe that? I'm trying to. Cole looked up at the stars, barely visible through the clouds. Ask me again in a week, and I might give you a different answer. Lyra almost smiled. Fair enough. They took turns on watch through the night. When morning came, cold and clear, they ate the last of their provisions and discussed their options. We need supplies, Cole said. Food, ammunition, cold weather gear to replace what we lost. That means going into a town, which means risk. What about one of these settlements on the map? Cole pulled out the map he'd taken from Keller. It had survived the cabin fire because he'd kept it in his coat pocket. There's a place called Pine Ridge about 15 miles north, small mining settlement, maybe 50 people. Probably has a general store. Will they ask questions? Probably, but we stick to our story. We're husband and wife, traveling to Helena, got caught in the weather, and need to resupply. Nothing unusual about that. Except we look like people who've been sleeping rough and running from something. Then we clean up before we go in, make ourselves look like travelers who hit hard weather, not fugitives. Cole folded the map. It's not perfect, but it's what we've got. They spent the morning making themselves presentable. Lyra did what she could with her hair while Cole scraped the worst of the grime from his face and coat. They wouldn't pass for wealthy travelers, but they might pass for poor ones. Pine Ridge turned out to be even smaller than the map suggested. Maybe 30 buildings total clustered around a played-out silver mine that looked like it hadn't produced anything valuable in years. The general store was at the center of town, a sagging structure that sold everything from flour to dynamite. Cole and Lyra tied their horses outside and went in together, playing their roles. The shopkeeper was an old man with suspicious eyes and hands that stayed below the counter where Cole couldn't see them. Help you folks? His tone suggested he'd rather not. Need supplies, Cole said. Flour, coffee, dried meat, ammunition if you've got it. Where are you headed? Helena, visiting family. The shopkeeper's eyes flicked to Lyra. Long way to travel in winter. My wife insisted. Cole managed a tired smile. You know how it is. The shopkeeper didn't smile back, but he also didn't reach for whatever weapon he had below the counter. He moved slowly, gathering the items Cole had requested and setting them on the counter. That'll be $12. Cole paid without haggling. As the shopkeeper bagged their purchases, a man entered the store. He was young, maybe 25, with the rough hands and weathered face of someone who worked outside. He nodded to the shopkeeper, then noticed Cole and Lyra. You folks just passing through? That's right, Cole said. Wouldn't happen to be looking for work, would you? Mine's mostly played out, but we could use someone good with a rifle. Been having trouble with bandits lately. Cole felt Lyra tense beside him. What kind of trouble? The organized kind. Group calling themselves the Syndicate has been trying to muscle in, claim they've got rights to operations in the territory. They burned out the Matthews place last week when old Matthews told them to go to hell. The young man spat. We've been trying to organize a defense, but most folks here are miners and farmers, not fighters. Cole's mind went into overdrive. The Syndicate was expanding operations, pushing into new territory. That's probably why they'd burned his cabin, not because they'd tracked him and Lyra specifically, but because they were clearing out anyone who might resist their expansion. Sorry, Cole said. We're not staying, but good luck with your defense. The young man nodded, disappointed but not surprised. Cole and Lyra gathered their supplies and left quickly. Outside, as they loaded their purchases onto the pack horse, Lyra spoke quietly. They're everywhere. The Syndicate's reach is bigger than we thought. Yeah, Cole tightened a strap. Which means hitting them is going to be harder than we planned. Or more important, Cole looked at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that if they're expanding this aggressively, they're overextended. Spreading their resources thin. That makes them vulnerable in ways they weren't before. It also makes them more dangerous. Desperate organizations do stupid, violent things. So do desperate people. Lyra mounted her horse. We're already at war with them, Cole. They just made that clear by burning your cabin. The question isn't whether we fight. It's how. Cole swung into his saddle. She was right, and he knew it. The syndicate had declared them enemies whether they liked it or not. Hiding would only work for so long. Eventually they'd be found and killed. But fighting meant accepting that they were probably going to die. It just gave them some control over how and when. "All right," Cole said. "Then we fight smart. We find their weak points and we exploit them. We make them bleed resources until they can't afford to chase us anymore." "How do we do that?" "We start by finding out where they keep their money. Every organization runs on cash. Cut off the money, and everything else falls apart." Cole turned his horse north. "And I think I know someone who might be able to help us with that." "Who?" "An old contact from my tracking days. Man named Sullivan, who used to run information between different territories. If anyone knows where the syndicate keeps its operational funds, it's him." "Where do we find him?" "Last I heard, he was working out of a place called Dead Horse Junction, about 40 miles northwest of here. It's not a friendly town, but Sullivan owes me a favor. He'll talk to us." They rode out of Pine Ridge heading northwest, leaving behind the small settlement and its frightened people. Cole felt the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The syndicate was bigger than he'd imagined, more organized, more ruthless. Fighting them was probably suicide, but so was doing nothing. Somewhere between those two options, Cole had to find a path that led to something other than death. He wasn't sure such a path existed. But Lyra was right about one thing. They were already at war. Might as well fight it on their terms while they still had the strength and will to do so. The sun was setting behind them as they climbed into higher country, painting the snow in shades of red that looked disturbingly like blood. Cole tried not to take it as an omen. He'd stopped believing in omens 3 years ago when Daniel died, despite every sign suggesting the job would be clean and easy. But he hadn't stopped believing in consequences. And the consequences of what they were planning were going to be severe, one way or another. Cole just hoped they'd live long enough to face them. Dead Horse Junction earned its name honestly. The town sat at a crossroads where 3 territories met, a place where laws from any direction barely reached and nobody asked too many questions. It was the kind of settlement that existed in the cracks of civilization, sustained by people who had reasons to avoid scrutiny. Cole and Lyra arrived after 2 days of hard riding through country that got progressively rougher and more desolate. The town itself was a collection of maybe 20 buildings, most of them saloons or boarding houses catering to drifters and criminals. The main street was mud and horse droppings, even in winter. "This is where your contact lives?" Lyra asked, eyeing a drunk who'd passed out against a hitching post. "Lives is a strong word. Sullivan operates here because nobody cares what he does as long as he doesn't cause trouble." Cole dismounted in front of a building with a faded sign reading "Rooms and Information." "Stay close and don't make eye contact with anyone." Inside, the place smelled like old whiskey and unwashed bodies. A woman behind a makeshift desk looked up as they entered. She was maybe 50, hard-faced and missing 2 fingers on her left hand. "Looking for Sullivan," Cole said. "Who's asking?" "Cole Harlan. Tell him I'm here about the Bitterroot job." The woman studied him for a long moment, then jerked her head toward a door at the back. "He's in his office, and keep your hands where I can see them." Cole and Lyra moved past her carefully. The back room was cramped and dark, lit by a single oil lamp. Sullivan sat behind a desk covered in papers and maps, a thin man in his 60s with sharp eyes and ink-stained fingers. He looked up as they entered, and his expression shifted from suspicion to recognition. "Cole Harlan. Thought you were dead." "Not yet." Cole closed the door behind them. "We need to talk." Sullivan's gaze moved to Lyra, then back to Cole. "The syndicate's offering $500 for a woman matching her description. That makes you either very brave or very stupid to walk in here with her." "You collecting bounties now?" "Not from friends, but I'm curious what brings you out of whatever hole you've been hiding in for the past 3 years." Cole pulled up a chair and sat down. Lyra remained standing, her hand near her coat where she'd hidden her pistol. Sullivan noticed but didn't comment. "I need information," Cole said, "about the syndicate, specifically where they keep their operating funds and how they move money between territories." Sullivan leaned back in his chair. "That's dangerous information to be asking for." "I'm aware." "You planning something stupid?" "Probably." Sullivan smiled thinly. "At least you're honest about it." He pulled a bottle from a drawer and poured 2 glasses, sliding one to Cole. "The syndicate's gotten big in the last year. They've consolidated operations across 3 territories, bought off enough officials to give them legal cover, and they're expanding into new areas every month. Crossing them is suicide. So I've noticed. They burned my cabin and they've sent multiple teams after Lyra here. We're already crossed with them, whether we like it or not. And you want to hit back? Sullivan sipped his drink. What makes you think you can do damage to an organization that size? Because big organizations have big vulnerabilities. They need cash to operate, and cash has to move through predictable channels. Cole accepted the glass, but didn't drink. You used to run those channels. You know how they work. Used to being the operative phrase. I got out of that business specifically because the syndicate was taking over and I didn't want to end up dead. Sullivan looked at Lyra. What's your stake in this, girl? Just survival or something more? Lyra met his gaze steadily. They killed my sister, worked her to death, and didn't pay for a doctor when she got sick. I want them to hurt the way she hurt. If that means I die trying, at least I die choosing my own end. Sullivan studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. That's more honest than most revenge talk I hear. He turned back to Cole. You remember that favor you did for me in Bitterroot? The one where you could have turned me in but didn't? I remember. All right, consider the debt paid. I'll tell you what I know. Sullivan pulled out a map and spread it on the desk. The syndicate runs its money through a central collection point every quarter. They gather cash from all their operations, consolidate it, then redistribute it for payroll and bribes and expansion. The collection happens in Helena at a building they own under a shell company. It's well guarded, but there's a window of vulnerability. What window? The money arrives over 3 days from different operations. During those 3 days, it's all stored in one place before being distributed. If you could get in during that window, you'd have access to maybe $20,000. Cole felt Lyra tense beside him. $20,000 was more money than either of them had seen in their entire lives. When's the next collection? Cole asked. 2 weeks from now. Starts on the 15th of the month. Sullivan traced a route on the map. But Cole, you need to understand what you're walking into. The building has armed guards, locks, and the syndicate's local management watching over it. Even if you somehow get the money, they'll hunt you to the ends of the earth for it. They're already hunting us, not like they will be after you rob them. There's a difference between being a nuisance and being a genuine threat. You cross that line, there's no coming back. Cole looked at Lyra. She was staring at the map, her expression unreadable. He knew what she was thinking because he was thinking it too. $20,000 could fund a war against the syndicate, or it could buy them new identities and passage to somewhere the syndicate couldn't reach. Either way, it was a chance they wouldn't get again. Tell me about the building's defenses, Cole said. Sullivan spent the next hour laying out everything he knew. The building was a former bank, 2 stories with a vault in the basement. 4 guards on rotation, 2 outside and 2 inside. The money was brought in through a side entrance and taken down to the vault immediately. The building had one weak point, a rear window on the 2nd floor that led to an office. It was barred, but the bars were old and could potentially be pried loose. You'd need to get in at night, get through the office to the stairwell, make it to the vault without being seen, crack the vault, and get out with enough cash to make it worthwhile, all without raising an alarm. Sullivan shook his head. It's a terrible plan. You got a better one? Yeah, don't do it. Take your girl and disappear into Canada or Mexico. The syndicate's reach doesn't extend that far. Cole stood. Thanks for the information, Sullivan. I owe you one. No, you don't. We're square. And Cole? Sullivan's expression was serious. You were a good tracker, smart, careful, thorough. Don't throw that away on revenge that won't bring anyone back. It's not about revenge. It's about living on our own terms instead of theirs. There's not much difference between those 2 things when you're dead. Cole nodded and led Lyra back out through the front room. As they stepped into the street, Lyra grabbed his arm. We're really doing this? Robbing the syndicate's collection point? You have a better idea? No, but $20,000 won't change the fact that they're bigger and stronger and more organized than we are. No, Cole agreed, but it gives us options, and right now, options are the only thing we don't have. They left Dead Horse Junction that afternoon and made camp 10 miles out. That night, sitting by a small fire, they discussed the plan in detail. It was risky, probably suicidal, and depended on a dozen things going right. But it was also the kind of bold move that organizations like the Syndicate never expected from people they'd written off as prey. We'll need to scout the building first, Cole said. Learn the guard rotations, find the best approach, identify escape routes. That means going to Helena and spending time there without being recognized. How do we do that? Same way we've been doing it. We're husband and wife, traveling through, looking for work. Nothing suspicious about that. And if someone recognizes me from the wanted posters, then we deal with it. Cole poked at the fire. But most people don't pay attention to posters. They see what they expect to see. You're not a fugitive anymore. You're Lyra Harlan, married to a tracker turned rancher trying to make a new life. Lyra was quiet for a moment. You really believe we can pull this off? I believe we can try. That's all anyone can do. They reached Helena 5 days later, having taken a circuitous route that added distance but reduced the chances of encountering syndicate patrols. The city was bigger than Blackwood Creek, maybe 1,500 people, with actual streets and municipal buildings and the trappings of civilization. The former bank building was in the commercial district, a solid stone structure that looked exactly like what Sullivan had described. Cole and Lyra walked past it twice without stopping, noting the guards and the traffic patterns and the surrounding buildings. That evening, from a boarding house across the street, they watched as a wagon arrived loaded with crates. 2 men unloaded them under the watchful eyes of the guards and carried them inside through the side entrance Sullivan had mentioned. That's the money, Lyra said quietly. Some of it. Sullivan said it comes in over 3 days. We hit on the 3rd night when it's all there, but before they start distributing it. How do we crack the vault? Cole had been thinking about that. We don't. We go through the office, down the stairs, and if we're lucky, the vault door will be open or poorly secured. If it's not, we take whatever cash we can find in the offices and get out. That's a lot of ifs. It's a robbery, not a military operation. There are always ifs. They spent the next week learning the building's rhythms. The guard rotation changed every 6 hours. The night shift was 2 older men who spent most of their time inside where it was warm. The rear window was barred, as Sullivan had said, but the bars were attached with old screws that had rusted in the mountain weather. Cole bought tools from different shops around the city, spreading out the purchases so no one would remember him buying everything needed for a break-in. Crowbar, rope, oil for the hinges, dark clothes. Small items that added up to a plan. 3 days before they intended to act, Lyra disappeared. Cole returned to their boarding house room to find her gone, her few possessions still there but no note. No sign of struggle. He fought down panic and forced himself to think. She wouldn't have run. She'd committed to this plan as fully as he had, which meant she'd gone somewhere and intended to come back. Cole spent 2 hours searching the nearby streets before he found her in a small church cemetery on the edge of town. She was sitting beside a grave, her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap. He approached quietly and saw the name on the headstone, Mara Voss, her sister. Cole sat down beside her without speaking. They stayed like that for several minutes, the only sound the wind moving through the bare trees. I didn't know she was buried here, Lyra said finally. I asked around and someone at the boarding house told me. The syndicate paid for the burial. Cheapest plot they could find, no service, just a hole in the ground and a marker with her name. I'm sorry. She deserved better. She deserved a life. Lyra's voice was tight. And they took that from her like it was nothing, like she was nothing. Cole understood. Daniel had gotten a proper funeral with honors and a widow who'd hated Cole for causing it, but at least there'd been recognition that his life had mattered. Mara had gotten a cheap grave and a sister who'd been too busy running to mourn properly. The robbery, Lyra said. It's not really about the money for me. You know that, right? I know. It's about making them feel what I felt. Making them lose something that matters. Making them understand that people aren't just property to be used up and thrown away. Lyra. Cole waited until she looked at him. That's not going to happen. Organizations don't feel things. They don't learn lessons. We take their money and they'll just squeeze it out of more people like your sister. That's how they work. Then why are we doing this? Because we're not organizations, we're people. And people need to matter, need to make choices that define who they are, even if those choices don't change the world. Cole looked at the grave. We can't bring your sister back. We can't make the syndicate feel remorse. But we can choose how we live and what we're willing to fight for. That has to be enough. Lyra wiped at her eyes. What if it's not enough? What if we do all this and nothing changes except we're dead? Then at least we die having chosen our own path instead of accepting the one they forced on us. That's more than most people get. They sat together until the sun started to set, then walked back to the boarding house in silence. Cole felt the weight of what they were about to attempt settling onto him like a physical thing. He'd robbed people before during his tracking days, taken bounties from men who'd stolen or killed, but this was different. This was walking into the heart of an organization that had already proven it would burn down homes and hunt people across territories. If they failed, they'd die. If they succeeded, they'd still probably die, just slower. But Lyra was right. It mattered that they tried. The night of the robbery came cold and clear. Cole and Lyra dressed in dark clothes and left the boarding house separately, meeting 2 blocks from the target building. It was just after midnight, the street empty except for a drunk sleeping off his evening in a doorway. They approached from the rear, moving through an alley that ran behind the commercial district. The back of the building was dark, the barred window barely visible in the shadows. Cole pulled out his tools and went to work on the screws holding the bars. They came out easier than he'd expected, the rust having eaten through the metal's integrity. Within 10 minutes, he had the bars removed and was working on the window itself. It was locked, but the lock was simple. Cole slid a thin blade between the frame and the sash, found the latch, and pushed it open. The window swung inward with a soft creak. Cole climbed through it first, finding himself in a dark office filled with filing cabinets and a large desk. Lyra followed, closing the window behind her. They stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing. No alarm, no footsteps, no indication they'd been detected. Cole moved to the office door and cracked it open. A hallway stretched beyond, lit by a single oil lamp. At the far end, he could see the top of the stairwell that led down to the vault level. They moved quickly and quietly, staying close to the wall. The building was silent except for distant voices from somewhere below, the guards, probably playing cards to pass the time. At the stairwell, Cole paused. Going down meant committing fully. Once they descended, there would be no quick escape if things went wrong. Lyra touched his shoulder, her expression asking the question. Cole nodded. They started down. The stairs were stone, their footsteps muffled but not silent. Cole descended slowly, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. Behind him, Lyra did the same. At the bottom, they found themselves in a short corridor. To the left, a door stood partially open, light and voices spilling out. The guards. To the right, the vault door loomed at the end of the hallway, massive and imposing, and standing open. Cole couldn't believe their luck. The vault was open, probably because the guards were in the middle of organizing the money that had come in over the past 3 days. He could see crates stacked inside, some open with bundles of cash visible. He gestured to Lyra, and they moved quickly toward the vault. The voices from the guard room continued, 2 men arguing about a card game, not paying attention to anything else. Inside the vault, Cole grabbed a canvas bag from a shelf and started loading it with cash. Lyra did the same, working quickly and quietly. They filled 2 bags with as much as they could carry, thousands of dollars compressed into portable weight. Cole was reaching for a 3rd bundle when he heard footsteps. He froze. Lyra did the same. The footsteps came closer, one person walking casually, not in a hurry. Cole set down the bag and moved behind a tall stack of crates, pulling Lyra with him. A guard entered the vault, a young man with a bored expression. He walked to one of the open crates and pulled out a ledger, then turned to leave. He'd made it 2 steps when he noticed the bags on the floor. The guard's expression shifted from boredom to confusion to alarm in the space of a second. He opened his mouth to shout. Cole hit him from behind, wrapping an arm around his throat and cutting off the sound before it could escape. The guard struggled, dropping the ledger and clawing at Cole's arm. He was young and strong and fighting for his life. Lyra stepped in and hit him hard across the temple with the barrel of her pistol. The guard went limp. Cole lowered him to the floor, breathing hard. "We need to move. Now!" They grabbed the bags and ran for the stairs. Behind them, Cole heard someone calling out from the guard room, asking if everything was all right. No answer meant the alarm would be raised in seconds. They took the stairs 2 at a time, the heavy bags banging against their legs. At the top, Cole shoved the hallway door open and they sprinted for the office. Behind them, shouting erupted. The guards had found their unconscious colleague. Cole practically threw Lyra through the window, then passed the bags out to her and climbed through himself. He pulled the window shut and they ran, leaving the bars where they'd fallen. The alley was still empty. They ran hard, the bags awkward and heavy, heading for where they'd left their horses 3 blocks away. Behind them, the building erupted with noise and light as the guards realized what had happened. They reached the horses and mounted quickly, the bags tied to their saddles. Cole spurred his horse into a gallop, Lyra right behind him. They thundered through the empty streets, heading for the north edge of town where they'd scouted an escape route. Behind them, bells started ringing, the alarm spreading. They rode hard for an hour, putting distance between themselves and Helena. When Cole finally slowed to let the horses breathe, they were deep in rough country with no sign of pursuit.
"Did we do it?" Lyra asked, her voice breathless. "Did we actually do it?"
Cole opened one of the bags and looked at the bundles of cash inside. More money than he'd ever seen in one place. "Yeah," he said. "We did it." They made camp in a canyon that offered concealment and multiple escape routes. As dawn broke, they counted the money. $18,000, give or take. Not quite what Sullivan had estimated, but close enough. Cole sat back and looked at the pile of cash, feeling nothing like triumph. They'd robbed the syndicate successfully, proven they could strike back. But all he felt was tired and wary, knowing that what they'd done would bring consequences neither of them could fully predict. "What now?" Lyra asked. "Now we disappear. Use this money to get somewhere the syndicate can't follow." "Where's that?" "I don't know yet. Canada, maybe. Or we head west to California, try to blend in where there are more people." Cole started repacking the money. "The important thing is we keep moving. Don't stay anywhere long enough to be found." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "Or we could do something else." "Like what?" "Like use this money to actually fight them. Not just run." She met his eyes. "That man in Pine Ridge said people were trying to organize a defense. What if we helped them? Used this money to fund resistance, to help others break free from the syndicate's control." Cole shook his head. "That's not survival, Lyra. That's martyrdom. Maybe, but it's also purpose." She gestured at the money. "This isn't enough to change everything, but it could be a start. We could give people hope, show them the syndicate isn't invincible. And we'd be dead within a month. Probably, but we'd matter. Our choices would mean something beyond just our own survival." Cole stared at her. She was serious. After everything they'd been through, all the running and fighting and barely surviving, she wanted to turn their robbery into the opening move of a larger war. It was insane. It was also exactly the kind of thing Lyra would think of. She'd never been good at accepting defeat or compromise. That's what had kept her alive this long. "You're asking me to throw away our chance at safety," Cole said quietly. "I'm asking you to choose what matters more. Living quietly somewhere else, or living loudly here, where we can make a difference." "Making a difference got my partner killed." "No. Making a bad decision got your partner killed. There's a difference between recklessness and purpose." Lyra leaned forward. "You told me by the cabin that you'd remembered what it felt like to matter. Was that true, or were you just saying what I needed to hear?" Cole didn't answer immediately. He thought about the last 3 years. The slow dissolution of self that came from choosing isolation over engagement. He thought about Daniel, about the man he'd been before guilt had hollowed him out. He thought about the cabin burning and the road that had led them here. And he thought about Lyra's sister, buried in a cheap grave with no one to remember her except a sibling who'd been forced to run. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it smart. No grand gestures, no throwing ourselves against walls we can't break. We help where we can. We hit the syndicate where it hurts, and we stay alive long enough to matter." Lyra smiled. "That's all I'm asking." They spent the next week making contact with the resistance that had started forming in small settlements. It wasn't much. Farmers and miners who'd been pushed too far, a few former lawmen who'd refused to be bought, people who were tired of being treated as property. Cole and Lyra provided funding, weapons purchased with syndicate money, and training and tactics that could work against a superior force. Word spread. People who'd been isolated, thinking they were alone in their resistance, discovered they weren't. The network grew slowly, carefully, with Cole and Lyra at its center, but never claiming leadership. They were facilitators, not commanders. The syndicate noticed. How could they not? Operations started failing, workers disappeared in the night, money went missing. They increased security, sent more enforcers, made examples of people they caught. But for every person they caught, 2 more joined the resistance. The syndicate had expanded too quickly, made too many enemies, pushed too hard. Now those enemies had organization and resources. 3 months after the Helena robbery, Cole and Lyra were camped in the mountains with a group of 20 fighters. They just hit a syndicate supply depot, distributing the food and equipment to workers who'd escaped labor camps. That night, sitting by the fire, Lyra asked Cole the question she'd been holding on to. "Do you regret it? Choosing this instead of running?" Cole thought about it. They were both wanted now, their faces on posters across 3 territories. They'd narrowly escaped capture twice and lost people they'd fought alongside. They were tired, scarred, and running on determination that got thinner every day. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. Even knowing it'll probably get us killed? Daniel died and I spent 3 years wishing I'd died with him. Then you showed up and reminded me that being alive means making choices that matter, even when those choices come with consequences." Cole looked at the people around the fire, former strangers now bound together by shared purpose. "This matters. Whatever happens to us, this matters." Lyra leaned against him. "For what it's worth, I think my sister would approve. She spent her life accepting what she was told was inevitable. We're proving nothing's inevitable if you're willing to fight for something different." The resistance continued to grow. By summer, the syndicate had pulled back from several territories, the cost of maintaining control exceeding the profit they could extract. It wasn't victory. The syndicate was too big to defeat completely, but it was progress. Cole and Lyra kept moving, kept fighting, kept building something that would outlast them. They trained others to lead so the movement wouldn't collapse if they were captured or killed. They documented the syndicate's crimes so that eventually, when the balance of power shifted enough, there might be real justice. They didn't talk about the future beyond the next week or the next operation. The future was uncertain and probably short. But the present was theirs, defined by choices they'd made freely rather than circumstances forced upon them. One evening, nearly a year after Lyra had first stumbled into Cole's cabin, they stood on a ridge overlooking a valley where a syndicate operation had been abandoned. The workers had left, the guards had withdrawn, and the building stood empty.
"We did that," Lyra said quietly. "We helped. But it was the people themselves who made it happen. Still, it's something." Cole nodded. It was something, not enough to balance all the scales or fix all the wrongs, but something real and tangible that wouldn't have existed if they'd chosen differently. Below them, someone was setting fire to the abandoned buildings. The flames caught quickly, sending up columns of smoke visible for miles, a signal to everyone watching that the syndicate could be resisted, could be beaten, could be made to pay a cost for their cruelty. "Do you think we'll survive this?" Lyra asked. "Honestly, probably not." "Good. I'd hate to think you were lying to me." She smiled faintly. "But if we don't, at least we lived on our own terms. That's more than my sister got. More than most people get." "Yeah, it is." They stood together watching the fire burn, 2 people who'd found each other by accident and chosen to build something from the wreckage of their separate pasts. They'd been broken by different circumstances, haunted by different ghosts, driven by different needs. But they'd learned the same hard truth. Survival without purpose was just slow death. Better to live fully and briefly than to exist hollowly for years. The sun set behind them, painting the smoke in shades of red and gold. Somewhere in the distance, more fires were being lit as other operations were abandoned or destroyed. The resistance they'd helped spark was spreading, becoming something beyond their control or their lives. It would outlast them. That was what mattered. Cole turned away from the fire and led Lyra back to where their horses waited. They had another operation to plan, another group to train, another small victory to win against an enemy that still had more resources and more power. But the enemy was bleeding now. Slowly, steadily, visibly bleeding. And 2 people who'd been written off as prey had become hunters instead, teaching others to do the same. They rode into the gathering dark, heading for the next fight, the next choice, the next moment where they could prove that people mattered more than profit and freedom was worth fighting for, even when the odds were stacked against you. The cabin where it had all started was ash. Daniel Reeves was still dead. Mara Voss was still in her cheap grave. Nothing could change those facts. But Lyra Voss was alive and free, choosing her own path. Cole Harlan had remembered what it meant to matter, to fight for something beyond his own guilt and isolation. And in the wilderness between territories where the syndicate's power had once seemed absolute, people were learning that they didn't have to accept being property. That resistance was possible, that courage could be contagious,
It wasn't the ending either Cole or Lyra had expected when she'd stumbled half-frozen into his cabin. It wasn't safe or comfortable or likely to last, but it was theirs, built from choice and purpose and the stubborn refusal to let powerful people decide what their lives would mean. In the end, that was all anyone could really ask for, the chance to matter, to choose, to fight for something worth fighting for even when victory wasn't guaranteed. Cole and Lyra had that chance. They'd seized it with both hands, and they weren't letting go. Whatever came next, capture, death, or the slim possibility of something better, they'd face it together, two broken people who'd learned how to be whole through the simple act of refusing to accept what others had decided they deserved. The stars emerged overhead as they rode, cold and distant and indifferent to human struggle. But beneath those stars, people were learning to resist, to hope, to believe that change was possible if you were willing to bleed for it. And two riders moved through the darkness, carrying that message forward, one choice at a time.